Charles Taylor, and I'm a professor emeritus of philosophy at McGill. In other words, I really not there anymore, but I am still there in a kind of retired capacity. Well, I mean, there's many ways that you can talk about it, but when we talk about pluralism as an important part of the modern society, we're talking about the ability to live together on a footing of equality and reasonable amity of people from very different cultures, different origins, different religions, different outlooks. I think it's absolutely essential relation. The ethic of modern democracy is an ethic of inclusion. That is, you know, we speak of all the citizens are equal, right? And any kind of decision has to bring everybody in and so on. So any kind of exclusion immediately is suspect in democracy. But we have people from extremely different backgrounds and cultures and so on. So the challenge is to avoid, I mean, you put it negatively if you like, to avoid sliding into a kind of exclusion in which some people become second-class citizens, they aren't considered on the same footing as the other. That's the very central ethic of democracy demands that. I think one of them is that we've always lived a duality, right? Because there's been French and English. Now, that doesn't sound like a plausible explanation in a way, because that was often lived in a very bad way with a sense of hostility. But I think that we never could quite get a picture of ourselves as a very homogeneous society, right? So when we became even more heterogeneous, which we did in several ways, I mean, immigrants coming from other parts of Europe than Anglo and Franco parts, and then the next phase is in the 60s when immigrants come from anywhere in the world. So as our society became more de facto plural like that, I think we had a possible model therefore, let's take this not as something to be overcome or forced together by assimilation, but and on the other hand, there are people that have resisted this, and they're the same people usually that resisted living the French-English relationship on the basis of equality and so on. But I think, you know, at a certain point, the thing can tip over, and the fact that we had these two. I mean, for instance, if you look at the way it worked out, you know, the bilingualism, biculturalism in the 60s, it caused a big problem in certain parts of Canada. People in Manitoba remember telling me, look, we have many more people of, let's say, German descent than we have of French descent, so why should they have any kind of special privileges? They have a CBC, which is servicing them, etc. And then we tried to explain, and people began to think that maybe there were different dimensions of diversity in Canada, right? And out of that, I guess it didn't have to happen. We were lucky that it happened. We arrived at this kind of understanding we have today of three dimensions of diversity in Canada, which shouldn't get in each other's way. I mean, the one is Aboriginals versus people who come here after Jacques Cartier, and the other is these two great English, Anglophone and Francophone society. And the third is the kind of diversity that comes with immigration. And we sort of sorted that out so that we stopped these different demands interfering with each other. I mean, in other words, we stopped using the relation with Aboriginals as a reason not to address this or vice versa. We made a kind of, I think, very crucial turnaround in our collective understanding. Not everybody agrees, right? There's resistance, but this kind of new model, new image of Canada, I think released us from all sorts of hang-ups we had before and opened up this possibility of what's called multiculturalism in English Canada.
It makes me think of the mosaic, that period of time when Canada coined itself as a mosaic.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, well, you see, the idea there was opposition, contrast to the United States. We aren't the melting pot was one was one thing, and the mosaic was another. And there wasn't all that much difference. I mean, in English Canada, in the States, in the sense that people were, and you could speak of America as a mosaic too. As a matter of fact, the melting pot is kind of melting pot was invented by what was it, Jewish immigrants, Zangville and so on. And yet you have, in the American case, just take the Jewish strand, they added a lot of their own to the cultures that a lot of people, we all use Yiddish expressions in North America, speaking English and so on. So there wasn't all that difference. But you're right, there was a subjective sense that we are different here north of the 49th parallel, and that's because we don't constrain people to assimilate like that. Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely been the case. We've had these fights from the very beginning, in a sense. The English-French one, there'd be people on both sides. So you had a certain, I mean, what we in Quebec identify with the Orange Lodges, les orangistes, we say in Quebec. There was people at that point thinking mainly on religious terms, Protestant versus Catholic, right? This is a Protestant country, and we've got to keep this Catholic phenomenon to the, its most confined expression. So we had long-term leadership of that kind. And then you had on our side in Quebec, you had very narrow outlook about what it was to be a Quebecer and how they had to be defended and so on. And but regularly there have been people leading from the other side saying that the strength of Canada is that it is different. There's a kind of alliance of difference. So I think we've had these two leaderships working against each other from the very beginning. Well, I think the challenges to pluralism are what we have in every modern Western society, which is receiving a lot of immigrants, which means the whole North Atlantic zone, which means a lot of Western Europe too. Except that we have an advantage over them, I mean over countries like Germany, Holland, and so on, that we've already conceived ourselves as immigrant societies for a couple of centuries, right? The way things work here is that a lot of people come and then they get citizenship status after a certain number of years. It's a kind of regular, routine matter. Whereas in the European case, they started to get a lot of immigrants in the 60s, and in Germany they called them Gastarbeiter, guest workers, so the mindset was they're going to return. And even the mindset among these immigrants was that they were going to return, make a pile of money and go back to Izmir and open a nice, coffee shop. And of course, we could have told them that's not going to happen, and they had to shift their outlook on it. So we had a kind of advantage. We foresaw what the problems are involved, and we put in place integration measures like, just simple things, making sure that the kids learn either English or French, where in Germany, you got people in Berlin, Turkish origin, who don't speak perfect German, don't speak perfect Turkish, So they're finally coming to grips with that. But on the other hand, what we weren't proof against was the arrival of people that really provoke kind of worry for our future. Where are we going, or what's going to become of us? I think both sides of the Atlantic are susceptible to feel that, because the diversity is getting more diverse. I mean, there was particularly if you have a society that's always lived with, let's say, Catholics, Protestants, Jews for centuries, and got so used to that, then arrive Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and so on, and there's this deep worry. So we find on both sides of the Atlantic now this kind of concern, particularly around Muslims, particularly with the geopolitical situation that's now going on, right? So we weren't necessarily that much wiser than our French and German and Dutch counterparts over there. in spite of the fact that we have this tremendously long experience of integrating immigrants. Well, I think it's played a good role and a bad role. That's very interesting. That is, you see, I mean, let's give you an example of the bad role. That, like in Quebec, we had this recent charter of values, but it was also a charter of secularism. It kept changing its title, but and it was pitched to the idea of what is required to be une société laïque, a secular society, right? It was copied from a little bit the French model, and there I think you have the worst kind of thing because it was really channeling what is very clearly a motivation of cultural discomfort among a lot of people. It was channeling it in a very moralistic way by saying they're violating one of our basic principles, which is secularism, right? So you get, laïcité used as a kind of club to beat people who are different, right? So, a Sikh wearing a turban is not really a threat to anybody, but it turns out to be, because it's a visible sign, it turns out to be, a danger to the whole fabric of society. That's the way it works negatively. The way it works positively is if you flip around and think, what does secularism really require, right? What is it? And you certainly come across one of the features of what it really requires is real even-handedness, that is real not being aligned with any one religion, not giving people different rights on the basis of their religious belief and so on. If you think of it in those terms, then you have a very powerful argument against something like the Quebec Charter. As a matter of fact, what we were, in the debate in Quebec, both sides, were invoking secularism. So really what one has to say here is that the big issue is how do you define that term, right? If you define that term the way, for instance, we do, the people that were on the same side as me do, then it's clear that it's something that is very positive. It can open the road to real acceptance of pluralism. If you define it the other way, then it can be an excuse for exclusion. It's not easy. I mean, what it involves, you have to look at the fear. And the fear is they're going to change us, What's going to become of us? Am I going to be able to hand on to my kids and my grandchildren, what's essential for me? And you have to get people to accept, another model of continuity. Where, one of the things is to get people to see, look, even if we didn't let anybody in, the way our culture is going to look in 30 years' time with the kids growing up and making their own choices is going to be very different. Just in Quebec, you don't need to look far to see examples of this, particularly after 1960, right? So you have to think of it as an open game, and you have to think of it as being, when you hand over the torch to the next generation, they will do what they want with it. They'll change it, right? So how can you make it such that they really value what's being handed down to them? And it really, it's not unlike how we behave with our children. We try to convince them that this and that is valuable, and we hope you'll carry it on. They don't always, but we try to, the only name of the game here is persuasion. The same thing goes for people who enter from outside, and they and their children are going to be partners in deciding this. And so, what is there going to be their disposition towards central features of our society? In Quebec, of course, we're talking about French as the main language, a certain historic reference points, and so on, yeah. And if you start exclusionary policies, you can ensure that they will not be favorably inclined towards that. The only hope of continuity is that we form some kind of, comity, sense of common purpose in which these people are included, and then history has to take care of itself. There's no guarantee. In other words, it would be nice if you could answer that by saying, I can give you an absolutely cast iron guarantee. But I mean, even if you wanted to say that, it's not believable, right? Because your own kids don't accept everything you pass on to them, right? But that's a hard sell. I mean, you see, because you can't say, no, I have a policy here which will ensure that. That's what they're looking for. But there isn't such a thing, right? You have to somehow convince people that confidence is never founded. It can never be based on fact. But there's another kind of, act of faith, act of hope in the future that you can make more true, by the way you respond today to these people who are coming from outside. Well, sometimes I think some other societies can learn certain things, and I'm thinking of the European societies that I was talking about, and I think some of them have looked over across the Atlantic, and not just from us, from the United States, from Argentina. It's very interesting. The whole Western Hemisphere has societies that have been, so they can. But that is. They're learning a lesson from a society which has successfully received a lot of immigrants. Now, if you're in a society where that isn't the case, right? And I mean, it's more the case than just the Western Hemisphere and the North Atlantic. I mean, you think of a society like South Africa, which is, among the problems are this hostility to people who come in from Rhodesia and so on, because there are a lot of people that, much worse off where they are, so they come in. But a lot of societies are not faced with a lot of immigrants coming in. They're faced with tremendous problems of historic conflict between different groups and so on. And I don't think that we have very much of a key to their. We have to be much more, in Canada, I think, much more modest. And we don't necessarily have a key to that, except that some very general things about, sitting down, talking, trying to make perhaps we in our quality of having English and French, that's something like an analogy to a society like Kenya with Luo and Kikuyu and so on. But, and so there are, I guess maybe very general lessons in our history of taking this diversity as a strength rather than a weakness, and trying to see how we can, we can really learn from each other. But the kernel of our great policies like multiculturalism or interculturalism aren't necessarily relevant there. Well, the thing is, what has to happen, and it very often does happen, is that, well, let's start from New York. We have this basic ethic which makes our society possible, which is this ethic of we accept each other's difference insofar as it doesn't endanger the ethic itself. I mean, obviously somebody's preaching intolerance, right? No, that makes our particular ethic. I mean, democracy, equality, human rights, non-discrimination, and therefore non-exclusion, right? This is the kernel of the political ethic that our society runs by. And we try to convince everybody who comes here that that's a terrific thing, and that's very important. And that's not, except if you start to introduce kinds of exclusion, in the normal course of events, that's not difficult. I mean, when we had this commission, Jean Bouchard and myself in Quebec, we asked a lot of people, why did you come to Canada, or why did you come to Quebec? There were two big reasons. One, freedom. Second was, I want my kids to have a chance that they'd never have if I'd stayed back in Algeria, Tunisia, whatever, right? So if that happens, I mean, if they're accorded freedom and not their lives aren't made very difficult, if they can get on and educate their children and so on, they are so happy about this. They feel so positive towards the society that they accept this ethic. Now, if you can ruin that, you can throw a spanner in the works if certain immigrant groups get the sense that we're being systematically discriminated against. I'm thinking of les banlieues parisiennes, you know, these suburbs in Paris and so on, and just sort of anger. And then part of that can be developing a counter-identity, which is perhaps, you know, challenging or rejecting certain fundamental features of this ethic, right? So the name of the game is we're recruiting people not just to be citizens of this country, et cetera, but we're recruiting people into a certain basic ethic. And very often that's a breeze because they already subscribe to it, and that's why they wanted to leave from X country to come here. But sometimes the whole process gets jammed by various kinds of discrimination or other obstacles or lack of success in integrating and so on. So it's something that you know, the process itself generally ensures will happen, but we have to stop it being in any way damaged or interfered with by by gratuitous divisions